She came to be claimed. She left as a queen. But between those two moments, there was fire, blood, and a room full of people who bet she would break. Aria Vale walked into the most powerful ballroom in the northern wolf territories wearing a dress her sister sewed by candlelight, carrying nothing but a 2-year-old promise and the quiet dignity of a woman who had never once asked the world to be kind to her. She did not know, standing at those gilded doors, that before midnight she would be rejected in front of hundreds and chosen by a king. Stay with me until the end of this story. Drop your city in the comments, hit that like button, and let's begin. The night of the Moon Alliance ball arrived the way all great and terrible nights do, slowly at first, and then all at once. In the village of Ashvin, tucked along the frostbitten edge of the northern wolf territories where the pine trees grew so dense and dark they swallowed the horizon whole, the morning of the ball began before sunrise. In a small cottage with cracked window glass and a chimney that smoked more than it warmed, 2 sisters worked by lamplight. Mira Vale, 19 years old, her dark hair pinned loosely at the back of her neck, sat cross-legged on the floor surrounded by ivory fabric, a needle threaded between her teeth, and a look of furious concentration on her face. She had been awake since 2 in the morning. She would not say so. "Hold still," she said, the needle emerging from between her teeth as she reached up toward her sister's waist. Aria Vale, 22, tall, with the kind of face that didn't ask to be looked at but was impossible to ignore, stood on the low wooden stool they used as a step when the top shelf needed reaching, arms slightly out at her sides, patient as stone. "I'm holding still," Aria said. "You're breathing too much." "I'm going to continue breathing, Mira." Mira tugged a seam tight and bit off a thread. "Fine. Breathe small." Aria looked down at the dress taking shape around her body, ivory, raw-hemmed at the collar in a style that was either old-fashioned or elegant depending on who was looking, and felt something complicated move through her chest. Not excitement exactly, not fear. Something that lived between the two, something that had been living there for 2 years, patient and heavy, waiting for tonight. "Do you think he'll actually do it?" Mira asked. She didn't look up from her work. Her voice was careful, the way a person's voice gets careful when they've been wanting to ask a question for a very long time. Aria was quiet for a moment. "He said he would." "I know what he said." Mira paused, needles suspended. "I'm asking what you think." Outside the window, a pre-dawn wind moved through the pines. Aria watched a branch shudder against the glass and thought about Lucas Crane, his sharp jaw, his easy confidence, the way he had looked at her 2 years ago at the harvest crossing when the rest of the northern pack hierarchy had walked past without seeing her at all. He had stopped. He had seen her. He had said, "I'll claim you at the moonball, publicly, before everyone who's ever overlooked you. I promise." She had held that promise like a coal in her palm for 24 months. Some nights it burned. Some nights it was the only warm thing she had. "I think," Aria said carefully, "that he has no reason to lie." Mira said nothing. She made 4 more stitches. "Then, that's not the same as saying you believe him." Aria stepped down from the stool and turned to look at herself in the small, square mirror propped against the wall. The dress caught the lamplight. Her sister's work was extraordinary. Small, perfect stitches along a fitted bodice, a skirt that moved like water, sleeves that tapered to her wrists. It was not the gown of a noblewoman. There was no silk, no embroidery, no jewels. But there was craft in it. There was love in it. And love, Aria had always believed, showed. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Mira appeared behind her in the mirror, dark circles under her eyes, a small smear of ivory thread on her chin, looking at her sister with an expression Aria recognized as the one Mira wore when she was trying not to say something she would later regret not saying. "Aria, don't. Mira." Aria turned and looked at her directly. "Tonight, I walk through those doors. I stand in that hall. Whatever happens, I face it. That's all I can do." Mira studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, pressed her lips together, and went back to pinning the hem. "The back seam needs one more pass," she said. "Sit down. I'll make tea." The Moon Alliance ball was held, as it had been for 11 generations, at Cravenhold Manor. a stone estate that rose from the northern highland ridge like something the mountain had grown deliberately, all dark towers and long-lit windows, torchlight burning in iron sconces along a road wide enough for 6 carriages abreast. Aria arrived by hired cart. She stepped down onto the gravel drive alone, straightened her spine, and walked toward the light. She had attended the Moonball twice before, once at 18, standing at the outer edges of the gathering as her mother's guest, invisible in the crowd of titled wolves who barely registered her existence. Once at 20, already 2 months into her silent understanding with Lucas, watching from a distance as he worked the room with the easy grace of a man born to inherit power and who had never once doubted he would. Both times she had left early. Both times she had walked home in the dark. Tonight was different. Tonight, Lucas Crane was going to stand in front of every alpha, every noble, every warrior in the Northern Territories and say, "This is mine, and I chose her." Tonight, Aria Vale, daughter of a low-ranking village pack, owner of one dress sewn by lamplight, possessor of no title and no land and no fortune, was going to become visible. She was almost sure of it. The entrance hall of Cravenhold was enormous. Vaulted ceilings hung with antler chandeliers dripping golden light onto a marble floor, so polished it reflected the crowd above it like a second world below. Aria paused at the top of the grand staircase, the way every arriving guest paused, and let the room assemble itself before her. The Northern Wolf hierarchy did not gather often. When it did, it gathered completely. She could see them spread across the ballroom below. Pack alphas from the Ridge clans in their formal coats, their mates jeweled and perfumed and held like trophies. Council elders seated at the long tables near the far wall, their conversation low and continuous and never quite about what it appeared to be. Young noble wolves circling each other with the barely concealed competitive energy of people who had grown up believing the world was a hierarchy and their position in it the most important fact about them. And there, near the center of the room, Lucas Crane. He was beautiful in the way of things that know they're beautiful, dark-suited, broad-shouldered, standing at the center of a small orbit of admirers with a glass of something amber in his hand and a smile that arrived on his face just a fraction too quickly, too smoothly, like a gesture practiced until it became automatic. He hadn't seen her yet. Aria descended the staircase. The first hour of this ball was a performance she had rehearsed in her imagination approximately 200 times. She moved through the crowd with the measured calm of a woman who did not need to hurry because the night was already hers. She greeted the few people who acknowledged her. Petrovos, a mid-rank wolf from Ashvin who'd known her mother, offered a surprised but genuine smile. Old Councilman Drev gave her a vague nod that she suspected was meant for someone behind her. 2 young noblewomen looked at her dress with the specific flatness of expression that meant they'd assessed it, found it wanting, and moved on. She did not let any of it show on her face. She had learned, growing up poor at the edge of pack society, that the most powerful thing she owned was the right to determine what her face revealed. No one could take that from her. Lucas saw her at the 40-minute mark. She was standing near the eastern window, holding a glass of cold wine she wasn't drinking, when she felt the shift in the room's attention, that subtle, animal awareness of being watched that every wolf knew in their blood, and turned. He was already moving toward her, weaving through the crowd, and for one long second she felt the coal in her palm flare back to life. He looked pleased to see her. He was smiling. "Aria." He reached her, leaned down to press a brief, formal kiss to her cheek. Public enough to register, private enough to deny. He smelled of expensive cedar and something smokier beneath. "You look—" He paused, and she watched his eyes move over the ivory dress, over her hair, over the total absence of jewelry or adornment. Something in his expression shifted, small and fast, like a cloud crossing a moon. "You look well." "Thank you," she said. "So do you. I wasn't sure you'd come. You asked me to." "I know." He touched her elbow briefly, the proprietary, automatic touch of a man who thought he could, and guided her a step sideways out of the direct path of a passing group of council members. "Listen, tonight's going to be— there are a lot of people here. Politics, alliances to manage. I may need to—" "Lucas," she said quietly. He stopped. She looked at him steadily. "We agreed on tonight. 2 years ago you made me a promise. I'm here. Are you? He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds before his own dropped, briefly, to somewhere around her collarbone. Then he looked up, and the easy confidence was back, that automatic smile, that practiced warmth. Of course, he said. I'll find you before midnight. He moved away into the crowd. She watched him go. The coal in her palm had gone cold. The next hour was the longest of her life. Aria stayed. She circulated slowly, she accepted a second glass of wine. She listened to Petra Voss talk about the mild winter and the problems with the eastern grazing boundary and the recent birth of her third grandchild. She laughed in the appropriate places. She was composed, she was present, she was performing the precise, exhausting labor of a woman who is terrified and will not show it. She watched Lucas. He was across the room most of the time, always in a cluster of people, always with that glass in his hand and that smile on his face. Once, he caught her eye from 30 feet away and gave her a small nod. Later, not yet, be patient. And she nodded back and turned away and put her wine glass down on the nearest surface before her hand could betray her. She noticed the woman at the 11:30 mark. Her name, she would learn later, was Celestine Ashworth, daughter of an old wealth pack in the Southern Ridge, holder of a title that stretched back 7 generations, polished from birth to fit exactly into rooms like this one. She was wearing a gown the deep blue of a winter midnight, diamonds at her throat, and she was standing close to Lucas Crane with the ease of a person who had never once doubted their right to stand exactly where they were standing. Aria watched Lucas lean down to say something into Celestine's ear. She watched Celestine laugh. She watched Lucas's hand settle at the small of Celestine's back. Not brief, not accidental, not the automatic proprietary touch he'd given Aria earlier. Settled, deliberate, the touch of a man who had already made a decision. And Aria, standing alone in her sister's handmade dress across a gilded room, understood. She had understood, she realized, since the cart ride here. Perhaps longer. Perhaps for months. The mind protects itself from truths it isn't ready to hold, and she had been protecting herself, and now the protection was over. She was very, very still. Breathe small, her sister's voice said somewhere in the back of her head. She breathed small. At 11:45, Lucas Crane stepped to the center of the ballroom. This was not unusual. The Moon Alliance ball had a formal claiming tradition, a moment in the latter portion of the evening when any alpha wishing to publicly declare a mate before the assembled pack community could do so. It was ceremony. It was theater. It was the kind of statement that, once made before this crowd, in this room, became indelible. The musicians stepped back. The crowd quieted. Aria, standing 15 feet from the eastern wall, felt every person in the room shift toward Lucas. She felt it the way you feel weather, not with your eyes, but with your skin. Lucas spoke clearly, loudly, with the projection of a man comfortable commanding rooms. I stand before the Moon Alliance as heir to the Crane Pack, he said, to make a formal declaration before the Northern Council and all assembled. He paused. He was excellent at pauses. Dramatic, weighted, timed like a performer. I claim Celestine Ashworth of the Ridgeline Pack as my chosen mate. The room filled with murmur, approving, social, the sound of a crowd watching a chess move that most of them had anticipated. Aria didn't move. She was aware, with the precise and terrible awareness of a person in the center of a very public moment, that several faces had turned toward her. Not to be cruel, perhaps. Or perhaps specifically to be cruel. She was known here, known as the village girl who'd been attached to Lucas Crane's orbit for 2 years, known as the one he'd been seen with, whispered about. People in rooms like this kept excellent track of such things. She did not move. She did not cry. She looked at Lucas Crane across the ballroom floor, standing with Celestine Ashworth at his side, and she thought, 2 years. She thought, I held a promise. She thought, he knew. He always knew. Then she lifted her chin, set her wine glass down on the nearest table with absolute steadiness, and turned toward the exit. She would not run. She would not crumble. She would walk out of this room with every piece of herself intact. She had made it approximately half the distance to the main doors. The crowd parting slightly around her, faces turning with that particular mixture of pity and entertainment that is uniquely human and uniquely cruel. When she heard the voice, low, calm, carrying across the room without effort, the way the voices of people accustomed to authority always carry. "Miss Vale?" She stopped. She turned, and that was when she first saw them. There were three of them, and they stood at the edge of the crowd the way apex predators stand at the edge of everything. Like the crowd was a landscape they were observing from a comfortable distance, like the room itself was slightly smaller for containing them. She had heard of the Thorne brothers. Everyone in the Northern Territories had heard of the Thorne brothers. You heard their names the way you heard about weather systems or geological formations, as facts of the world that existed at a scale beyond argument. The youngest, Adrian Thorne, was perhaps 25, blonde, sharp-featured, with light eyes that were doing something very close to laughing even now, even in this moment. He was watching her the way a person watches something that surprises them pleasantly. Beside him, Kyle Thorne, broader, darker, with the kind of stillness that is actually coiled motion, ready but not yet deployed. He had not smiled. He was looking at her with direct, undisguised assessment, and between them, slightly forward, because men like that are always slightly forward, because the room always arranges itself around them without their having to ask, was Ryland Thorne. King Ryland Thorne. Alpha of the Southern Thorne Pack, the largest unified wolf territory south of the Highland Ridge. A man who, by the reckoning of pack law and council record, held more consolidated power than any single alpha in the Northern or Southern Territories combined. She knew his name. She knew his reputation. What she had not known, had not been prepared for, was the reality of him standing 10 feet away in a room where she had just been publicly discarded like something that had outlived its usefulness. He was looking at her, not at the spectacle she had just been part of, not at Lucas Crane, who she could hear behind her resuming some murmured conversation, already moving forward, already done with her. Ryland Thorne was looking at her, at Aria Vale specifically, in her sister's handmade ivory dress, with her wine-stained fingers and her carefully steady chin, with an expression she couldn't quite read. It was not pity. That was the first thing she noticed. Whatever was in that expression, it was not pity. He was the one who had spoken her name. He spoke again. "You were about to leave," he said. "Yes," she said. A pause. "Don't." He said it simply, without decoration, without the kind of courtly framing she'd have expected from a man of his position in a room like this. Just don't. Behind him, Adrian Thorne was now visibly grinning. Kyle had uncrossed his arms. Aria looked at Ryland Thorne and said, with the very last reserve of composure she had available to her, "I beg your pardon?" Ryland took one step forward, just one, the kind of step that didn't shorten distance so much as redefine the nature of the space between two people. "I said don't leave." His voice was low, even. "Not yet. There is something that should happen here first." From her left, she heard Adrian speak, easy, almost conversational, carrying its own particular weight beneath the lightness. "What my brother means," Adrian said, "is that the night isn't finished, and neither, if she'll allow it, is her story in this room." And then, extraordinarily, both Kyle and Adrian Thorne stepped forward, flanking their brother, forming a loose arc of three men between her and the door. And in the suddenly completely silent ballroom of Cravenhold Manor, with 200 wolves watching, Kyle Thorne said, "I would claim you." And Adrian Thorne said, "As would I." And Ryland Thorne said nothing for a moment. He looked at her in that steady, unreadable way and then said quietly enough that it was almost only for her, "So would I." The ballroom did not breathe. Aria Vale stood in the center of it, humiliated, still, heartbroken in the efficient way of someone who had been preparing for heartbreak, and so had it organized already, compartmentalized, survivable, and looked at these three men who had just turned the most painful night of her life into something she had no framework to understand. Behind her, she heard a sound. She recognized it. It was the sound of Lucas Crane setting down his glass. He said, in a voice that had gone very carefully flat, "She's mine." The three Thorne brothers did not look at him. They kept their eyes on Aria. It was Adrian who said, still with that light, almost pleasant tone that somehow made it sharper. She was yours. Past tense seems appropriate, given what just happened in this room. He tilted his head. Unless I misunderstood the claiming, Lucas's voice hardened. That's pack politics. She understands. I understand, Aria said. Her own voice surprised her. Clear, steady, not loud, but cutting through the room the way quietness sometimes cuts when everyone around it is performing noise. She looked at Lucas. She looked at him completely, with the full weight of 2 years and everything they'd meant and everything they'd cost. And she let herself see him clearly, perhaps for the first time. A man who had made a promise he'd never intended to keep, who had used her patience and her faith as a placeholder while he arranged the future he'd always planned, who now that 3 Southern alphas had turned their attention to her, wanted her back not because he valued her, but because someone else did. She looked at him until he looked away. Then she turned back to the Thorne brothers. Her voice, when she spoke, was the steadiest it had been all night. The 3 of you are serious, she said. It wasn't quite a question. We are, Ryland said. You don't know me. We know what we've seen tonight, he said. That's enough. She studied him. She studied all 3 of them. The room was still holding its breath. Then, she said slowly, what happens now? It was Kyle who answered, and the smile he gave her then, brief and dangerous and somehow honest, was the first smile she had received all evening that didn't want something from her before it finished arriving. Now, Kyle said, we find out who among us is worthy. And the night, the long, unbearable, extraordinary night, shifted into something none of them had entirely anticipated. The ballroom had come alive again behind her. She could feel it, the electric, dangerous energy of a room full of wolves who had come expecting ceremony and had gotten instead something much older and much more real. Pack law, contest, blood and dominance and the ancient machinery of what they all were, under the clothes and the chandeliers and the careful social performance of civilization. Lucas Crane, she heard, was speaking to someone on the council. His voice had taken on a new register, not the easy practiced confidence of earlier, but something tighter, something that told her the calculation in his chest had shifted entirely. She kept her eyes on Ryland Thorne. He kept his eyes on her. Whatever happens in this room tonight, he said quietly, still for her alone, you are not a prize. Understand that. Whatever any of us claims, you have a voice. That has not changed. Aria looked at him for a long moment. Then very carefully she said, prove it. And Ryland Thorne, king of the Southern Pack, most powerful alpha in 2 territories, a man who had walked into this ballroom tonight for reasons that were only now becoming clear, gave her something she had not expected. He smiled. Not the automatic smile. Not the practiced confidence. Something quieter and more real and entirely directed at her. I intend to, he said. The ivory dress caught the candlelight. The chandeliers burned overhead. 200 wolves waited. And Aria Vale, who had come to this ball to finally be seen, who had spent 2 years invisible and 1 hour destroyed, stood at the center of the most powerful room in the Northern Territories and understood for the first time that the night was not over. It had just, in every way that mattered, begun. The council elder moved first. His name was Councilman Aldrich Voss. No relation to Petra, though they shared the same broad northern features and the same habit of speaking slowly enough that their words arrived with the weight of things that had been considered, turned over, examined from every angle before release. He was 70 or thereabouts, with white hair cropped close and eyes the pale gray of winter ice. And he had been governing pack law in the Northern Territories for longer than most of the people in this room had been alive. He stepped forward from the long council table near the far wall, and the crowd parted for him the way crowds part for authority. Not out of affection, but out of the deep animal recognition that some forces are better not impeded. He stopped in the open space between Aria and the Thorne brothers. He looked at neither of them directly. He looked instead at the room. What has been invoked, he said, in his careful, weighted way, must be acknowledged. Murmur, movement, 200 wolves adjusting their understanding of what kind of night this had become. Aldrich continued, 3 alphas have put forward a claim before assembled pack witnesses. Pack law, as written in the Highland Accord of the third generation, recognizes any such simultaneous claim as a contest of standing. He paused. The relevant parties will step forward and confirm their intent. Adrian Thorne glanced sideways at his brother Kyle, and something passed between them. Not quite a look of surprise, not quite amusement, some third thing that lived in the space between those two, in the way that language lives between people who have known each other long enough to have their own. Kale stepped forward. "Confirmed," he said simply. Adrian followed. "Confirmed." Rylan had not moved. He was still looking at Aria. Then he turned to face the council elder, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet, undecorated authority it always did. The authority of a man who had never needed volume because he'd never once doubted he'd be heard. "Confirmed," he said. Aldrich turned his ice-pale eyes to Lucas Crane. Lucas had come forward sometime in the past 30 seconds. Aria had heard him moving, had felt the shift in the room's attention, and he was standing now perhaps 6 feet to her left, his jaw set, his glass somewhere behind him, left behind in the urgency of whatever decision had just reorganized itself inside him. "Lucas Crane," the elder said, "you performed a public claiming rejection at 11:47 this evening. The record stands. However, under the Highland Accord, a rejected party who receives a competing claim within the same moon gathering retains the option of counter-contest. Do you invoke?" The room waited. Lucas looked at Aria. His expression had passed through several phases in the last few minutes. Shock, calculation, something that might have been pride rearranging itself into something that wasn't quite anger, but was adjacent to it. Now it settled into something she recognized from 2 years of reading his face. Determination. Not the warm kind. The kind that had more to do with not losing than with winning. "I invoke," Lucas said. Aldrich nodded, once as though he had expected this and found it neither surprising nor interesting. "Then we have 4 alphas in contest." He looked out at the assembled hall. "The ballroom floor will be cleared. The moon ball is now a contest of standing. All witnesses will observe pack law." The musicians had long since stopped. Now the staff moved quietly, efficiently, the way people move when they've been trained for contingencies. Rolling back the rugs, drawing the long tables toward the walls, creating from the center of the ornate ballroom a space that was suddenly, unmistakably, an arena. Aria did not move during any of this. She stood in the center of the clearing space like the eye of something, and people moved around her and she watched them, and she was very, very calm in the specific way that people become calm when they have run out of ordinary feelings and arrived somewhere beyond them. Petra Voss materialized at her elbow. "Come stand at the edge," Petra said quietly. "You don't want to be in the middle of the floor when they shift." Aria let herself be guided to the edge of the cleared space, and she stood there with the crowd pressing gently at her back and the open floor before her, and she watched the 4 men take their positions. Lucas on the north side of the floor, loosening his jacket with the tight, controlled movements of someone managing adrenaline. Kale and Adrian to the south and east, already shrugging free of their formal coats with the ease of men for whom this was not an occasion, but a familiar state. And Rylan Thorne had moved to the center of the floor and stood there as the space organized itself around him, and he was looking at her again, across the 20 feet of open marble between them, and the look on his face was not triumph or aggression or any of the things she might have predicted. He looked, she thought, resolved, like a man who had made a decision some time ago and was now simply arriving at the moment the decision required. She held his gaze. She didn't know why. She told herself it was because looking away would show weakness, and she had decided she was done showing weakness tonight. But that wasn't entirely true, and she knew it. She held his gaze because there was something in it she hadn't expected to find in this room tonight, something steady, something that didn't want anything from her yet. The elder raised his hand. The chandeliers burned overhead. The room held its breath. He dropped his hand, and the 4 men shifted. The sound of it was something Aria had heard before. She had grown up at the edge of pack territory. She knew what a shift sounded like, the low crack and surge of it, the way the air changed. But she had never heard 4 simultaneous alpha shifts in an enclosed space, and the reality of it hit the assembled crowd like a pressure change, like the moment before lightning when the air goes electric and everyone's body knows, before their mind does, that something enormous is about to happen. Where the four men had stood, four wolves now occupied the floor. Lucas's wolf was large, pale gray, long-legged, lean with the kind of conditioning that spoke to deliberate training. He was beautiful, if you were the kind of person who could see beauty in a thing that was currently circling with its hackles raised. His ears were flat, his eyes bright with a controlled fury that was either wounded pride or genuine intent. She suspected both. Kale's wolf was dark, nearly black, with a broad chest and a low rolling gait that suggested patience rather than aggression. The kind of patience that was only possible in something that understood its own strength well enough not to need to prove it constantly. Adrian's wolf was lighter, almost silver at the tips, and moved differently than his brother's. Quicker, angular, with a restless intelligence that expressed itself in constant micro-adjustments, reading the geometry of the floor, reading the other wolves, always 3 calculations ahead. And Rylan's wolf was larger than she'd anticipated. Darker than Kyle, immense across the shoulders, moving with a deliberateness that was somehow more frightening than speed. Where other wolves announced their presence through motion, Rylan's wolf announced it through stillness. He stood in the center of the floor, and the other 3 wolves oriented around him the way satellites orient around mass. Not out of submission, not yet, but out of the involuntary recognition of something gravitational. His eyes, even in wolf form, were on her. She didn't look away. Behind her, she heard a woman she didn't know whisper to her companion, "The village girl is going to get someone killed." Aria heard it, absorbed it, filed it in the place where she kept the things people said about her that were designed to make her feel responsible for the circumstances others had created around her. She kept her eyes on the floor. Lucas moved first. He didn't go for the Thorne brothers, not initially. He angled toward the center of the floor and circled, his gaze moving between Kyle and Adrian with the tactical assessment of a wolf who'd fought before and understood that eliminating the most mobile threat first was better strategy than going directly for the largest. He feinted toward Adrian, sharp and sudden, and Adrian's silver wolf was already moving before the feint completed, a sidestep so fluid it looked choreographed, and in the half-second of Lucas's adjustment, Kyle was on him. It was fast. It was brutal in the compressed, efficient way of things that know exactly what they're doing. Kale's dark wolf hit Lucas mid-pivot, not with the reckless full-body crash of an animal fighting on emotion, but with the controlled, targeted force of something that had calculated the impact, chosen the shoulder, expected the counter. Lucas went down and came back up fast, faster than she'd expected. And for a moment the 2 wolves were locked, standing, pushing against each other with everything they had, and the sound of it filled the ballroom. Adrian circled the outside of the struggle, watching, not yet entering. She understood why, watching him. He was letting his brother work, conserving, reading, waiting for the precise moment when his involvement would be most efficient. A pack tactic, a brother's tactic. They had done this before. Lucas seemed to understand it too, because he broke from Kyle with a sudden backward lunge, eating the cost of it, accepting the torn flank, and turned, snarling, to put the wall at his back and take the angle away from Adrian. Clever, she thought, despite herself. He was still in this. He was in it for another 4 minutes of brutal, shifting engagement that moved across the cleared floor like a storm cell, concentrated and violent, and completely indifferent to the gilded room containing it. By the end of it, Lucas Crane's wolf was bleeding from the shoulder and one haunch, and he was standing in the center of the floor with both Thorne brothers circling him, and he made the calculation that she suspected every honest fighter eventually makes, the one where you admit privately whether the cost of continuing is higher than the cost of stopping. He went still. Kale and Adrian stopped circling. Lucas's wolf lowered his head, not to the floor, not fully, but enough. The specific degree of submission that said, "This field, to you, not the war, but this field." The crowd exhaled. Petrovos touched Aria's arm briefly and said nothing. Aria watched Lucas shift back. The sound of it, the slow return to the shape he wore in the world. The formal clothes now torn at the shoulder and dark with blood he'd have to explain to someone, and she felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, something quieter and sadder than either. The feeling of watching a lock open on a door you'd been trying to get through for so long that by the time it opened, you'd forgotten what you'd wanted on the other side. He stood in human form in the middle of the cleared floor, breathing hard, and he looked at her. She didn't know what he was expecting. She didn't know if he was expecting anything. His face had shed its performance, the easy confidence, the practiced warmth, all of it gone, scraped away by whatever had just happened on that floor, and what was left underneath was something younger and less certain. A man who had made a very large mistake and was only now understanding the dimensions of it. She looked at him, and then she looked away. She turned her attention to the floor, where Kyle and Adrian Thorne were regarding each other in wolf form with the particular quality of stillness that precedes a very serious conversation. This, she understood, was the part that mattered. The brothers' contest began without ceremony. There was no circling, no preliminary assessment. They knew each other too well for that, had grown up fighting each other and fighting alongside each other in equal measure, and so there was none of the theatrical posturing of strangers. There was just the sudden, total engagement of two wolves who understood each other's capabilities completely and were going to test the gap between understanding and reality. Kyle was heavier. Adrian was faster. The match between those two facts produced something extraordinary to watch. A fluid, continuous exchange that never quite resolved, that seemed always on the verge of conclusion and then wasn't, that pushed the gathered crowd backward in incremental steps without anyone noticing they'd moved. Aria watched it and felt the specific discomfort of someone who was both the cause and the witness of something they hadn't asked for and couldn't stop. At her elbow, a voice she didn't recognize said, with the particular edge of someone who wanted to be overheard, "She's enjoying this. Look at her." "Of course she is," said another voice, equally calculated in its reach. "What village girl wouldn't? 3 alphas fighting over her like she's a prize cow at the harvest fair. She's probably been scheming toward something like this for years." Aria kept her eyes forward. "She doesn't even have a pack name," the first voice continued. "Vale. That's just a landmarker. She's nobody from nowhere, and she's going to get both those boys hurt because she doesn't have the grace to just walk out when she's been rejected." A third voice, older, quieter, but no less deliberate. "The Crane Heir will never forgive this. Whatever comes out of tonight, she's made enemies she doesn't have the standing to manage." Aria breathed in, breathed out. She had grown up in Ashvin, where the wolves with pack names looked through her and her sister and her mother the way you look through glass. Aware of the surface, indifferent to what was behind it. She had grown up being the girl whose mother had mated below her standing and paid for it socially for the rest of her life. She had grown up learning that certain rooms were not built for her, and that the effort of being in them, the constant effort of standing straight and breathing small and refusing to show the cost, that was the price of admission, and it was always higher for people like her. She had paid it. She had always paid it. She was paying it right now, standing at the edge of this arena with her sister's handmade dress and her carefully controlled face, listening to people who would not have spoken to her an hour ago now speaking loudly enough that she was supposed to hear. What she would not do, what she had decided, somewhere in the last hour, with the specific cold clarity that comes after the worst thing has already happened and you're still standing, what she would not do was give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She was still here. She was still standing. And whatever happened on that floor, that was hers. That had been done for her, or at least in her direction, which was more than this room had offered her when she walked in. On the floor, Kyle and Adrian were reaching the conclusion the crowd had been waiting for. Adrian was bleeding, a clean gash above his left shoulder that had opened in the last exchange and was now making the floor slick, affecting his footwork in a way he was compensating for but couldn't fully correct. Kyle had a bite taken from his right flank that had slowed his closing speed. They were even. They were not even. They were two brothers who knew each other completely and were now discovering whether knowledge or body was the deciding factor. It was Kyle who broke the parity, not dramatically, not with some overwhelming display of force, but with a single movement that was more tactical than physical. He stopped fighting Adrian and sat down. The crowd made a sound. Adrian's wolf stopped, looked at his brother. There was something in that exchange, something wordless and layered and entirely private, that had nothing to do with the assembled crowd watching it. Then Adrian sat down too. Then, after a moment, both brothers looked at Rylan. Rylan's wolf had not moved from the center of the floor for the entirety of the two contests. He had stood there, watching, enormous and still. And he was still standing there now, as his brothers settled and the floor went quiet, and the attention of 200 wolves collected on him like water finding low ground. He was looking at Aria. She met his gaze across the width of the floor and held it, and the room disappeared. Not literally, not even mostly, but in the particular way that certain moments of direct human attention create a pocket of privacy inside a public space. The elder's voice came from somewhere to her right. One alpha remains in contest. Under the Highland Accord, Rylan Thorne of the Southern Pack is recognized as the winning contender. A pause. The choice, under pack law, now belongs to the claimed. The crowd turned to look at her. All of them. All at once. Every face in that gilded room, with its antler chandeliers and its polished marble floor, and its 200 wolves who had come here for music and politics, and the comfortable theater of their social order. Every single one of them turned to look at Aria Vale. The woman who had walked in, nobody. The village girl in the handmade dress. The one they'd watched get discarded and then fought over, and now, by the terms of a law she hadn't invoked and a night she hadn't designed, stood at the center of. She heard it again, quieter now, aware that it might be heard, but still. What's she going to do? And from somewhere else, a woman's voice, not unkind, but not kind either. She'll accept. What choice does she have? A girl like that doesn't say no to a Southern king. A girl like that? Aria Vale looked at the woman who had said it, older, titled, wearing blue silk and a strand of pearls and the absolute assumption of her own authority. She looked at her for one long second. The woman did not look away. She had the confidence of someone who had never been required to. Then Aria looked back at the floor. At Rylan's wolf, massive and still, and watching her with those dark, steady eyes. At the empty space between them. She had come here tonight to finally be chosen by the man she'd trusted. That hadn't happened. She had been rejected, publicly, and then defended, publicly, by strangers who owed her nothing. And now she was standing here, at the end of an extraordinary and terrible evening, being asked to make a choice that would define the next phase of her life in front of every person in this room who had already decided what she was worth. She thought about Mira. Awake since 2 a.m, needle between her teeth, making something beautiful out of almost nothing, because that was what the Vale women did. They made things work. They found the way through. They did not stand in corners waiting for permission. She looked at Rylan Thorne. "Shift back," she said. Her voice was clear, steady, loud enough for the room. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Surprise, or something adjacent to it, the specific social discomfort of a person from the margins issuing a direct instruction to someone at the absolute center. Rylan's wolf looked at her for a long moment. Then he shifted. The return was slower than the initial shift had been. Not labored, but deliberate. The way everything he did was deliberate, and when he stood before her in human form again, he was still large and still, and his dark eyes were on her face and his expression was exactly what it had been before the contest began. Resolved. "You asked me to prove it," he said. His voice was even, a little rough from the shift. "I'm proving it." "By winning a fight," she said. "By being the last one standing." He held her gaze. "That's how it works here. That's the law." "I know what the law is," she said. "I'm asking you something different." The room was very quiet. "Ask," he said. She looked at him. At this man she didn't know, this king of a territory she'd never visited, who had crossed a ballroom floor toward a woman being publicly humiliated and had said, "Don't leave with the straightforward certainty of someone stating a fact." And she asked the only question that actually mattered. "If I said no, right now, to all of it, to the claim, to the contest, to everything this night has become." She kept her voice level. "What would you do?" The room held itself very still. Rylan Thorne did not hesitate. "I would call for your cart," he said, "and make sure you got home safely." Behind him, she heard Adrian Thorne make a quiet sound that might have been a laugh. She looked at Rylan for a long time, long enough that the crowd's discomfort with the silence became almost a physical thing, pressing at the edges of the room. Then she said, "You can call for the cart," but I didn't say no. Something moved in his expression. Small, fast, genuine, gone before it fully arrived. "Then what did you say?" he asked. "I said," Aria told him, in a voice that was fully steady now, fully and completely hers, "that I'll choose for myself. Not because pack law says I have to, not because the room expects me to, not because you want to fight." She looked at him directly. "Because I decide." Rylan held her gaze, and then there it was again, the smile, the real one, the quiet one that had nothing performed in it at all. He inclined his head. "That," he said, "is exactly what I hoped you'd say." From the far side of the room, past the crowd, past the council table, past the careful social architecture of the Northern Pack hierarchy in all its jeweled and titled self-regard, she heard the woman in the blue silk say something to her companion in a low voice. She couldn't make out the words. She didn't need to. Let them say it. Let all of them say whatever they were going to say. She had been invisible in this room for the entirety of her life. And then she had been a spectacle. And now she was something else. Something none of them had prepared a category for. And that confusion in the room around her, that discomfort, that low hum of a social order encountering an outcome it hadn't predicted. That was hers. She had earned that tonight in the worst hours of her life. She turned to Elder Aldrich, who had been standing at the edge of the cleared floor with the patient expression of a man who had seen a great many things and been surprised by almost none of them. "Councilman," she said, "what do I need to do?" Aldrich looked at her. Something moved in his pale gray eyes. Not warmth exactly, but something adjacent. Recognition, perhaps. The specific acknowledgement of a person who has assessed something carefully and found it worth acknowledging. "You stand before the assembly," he said, "and you speak your choice." She turned back to the room. 200 faces. Every title, every rank, every social calculus the Northern Territories had spent 11 generations building. The chandeliers burned overhead. The floor was marked from the contest. Somewhere on the far side of the crowd, Lucas Crane was a bleeding man with a torn shoulder standing in the ruins of an evening he'd thought he'd controlled. Aria Vale straightened her spine. She lifted her chin. She did the thing she had been doing her whole life in rooms that didn't want her in them. She made herself completely, undeniably present. "I am Aria Vale of Ashfin," she said, to the room, to the crowd, to the council elder, and the titled wolves, and the woman in the blue silk, and whoever else was listening. "I have no pack name and no title and no land. I came here tonight to be claimed by a man who'd promised me 2 years ago, and he chose differently, and that is done." She paused. "What is not done is my right to make my own choice, in front of witnesses, by my own will." She turned to Rylan. He was watching her with that absolute attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he moved through the world. Fully present, fully seeing, not managing his expression or calculating his reception, but simply, completely there. "Rylan Thorne," she said. "Aria Vale," he said. "I accept your claim." She held his gaze. "On the condition that what you said is true, that I keep my voice, that I remain who I am." "I said it," he said. "I meant it." "Then we understand each other." The elder began to speak. The formal words of the accord, the language of pack law that had governed this moment for 11 generations. But Aria was aware only peripherally of the ceremony, of the crowd, of the social machinery of the room reassembling itself around an outcome it hadn't anticipated. What she was primarily aware of was the look on Ryland's face as the formal words were spoken, the steadiness of it, the absence of performance, the sense, new to her, strange to her, requiring more investigation than she had the capacity for tonight, that whatever this man had decided about her, he had decided it some time ago. That tonight was not the beginning of something he'd just thought of. That she filed away. For later. For the long hours of the cart ride back. For the night's aftermath, when the adrenaline metabolized and she would sit with the truth of what had happened in this room and try to understand it. For now, she was still here. She was still standing. She was, if the law and the room and Ryland Thorne were to be believed, no longer nobody from nowhere. She was, for better or for worse, something the Northern Territories were going to have to figure out what to do with. The formal words ended. The elders stepped back. The crowd remained, some of them watching her with curiosity, some with calculation, some with the specific displeasure of people whose social predictions had failed, and a few, a small number but unmistakably there, with something that was almost but not quite approval. The chandeliers burned on. The marble floor held its marks. The ball that had started as theater had become something entirely else, and Aria Vale stood in the center of it, in her sister's handmade dress, with her steady chin and her quiet hands and the full weight of an impossible evening in her bones, and looked at the man who had just changed everything about what her life was going to be. She didn't know him. She didn't know his territory, his people, his laws, or the thousand ordinary details of a life built in the South. She didn't know what she'd been claimed into. Not fully, not yet. She only knew what she'd seen tonight. A man who had come across a room when it would have cost him nothing to stay where he was, and who had, when given every opportunity to reduce her to a circumstance, treated her instead like a person with a choice. It was a beginning. It was thin, as beginnings go, and the road out of this room was long and ran through difficult country. But she had always known how to walk. She had always known how to walk. What she hadn't known, what no amount of growing up poor at the edge of pack society had prepared her for, was what it felt like to walk out of a room like that one. The crowd parted for her now. Not grudgingly, not with the impatient shuffle of people making way for someone they didn't want to acknowledge, but with the specific, slightly stunned quality of a room that had witnessed something it needed time to process. Eyes followed her. She felt them the way you feel weather, not with sight, but with skin. Reelin walked beside her. Not behind her, not ahead of her. Beside. Close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air of the estate's front hall, but not so close that it felt like management. Kael and Adrian flanked them further out, moving with the easy competence of men accustomed to navigating from the edges. They reached the entrance hall. A staff member materialized with Aria's cloak. She hadn't checked one, she hadn't had one worth checking, and for a moment she was certain the man had made a mistake. And then she saw it was one of the estate cloaks, heavy charcoal wool lined in something soft, and she understood that someone had made a decision on her behalf in the last 10 minutes without making a production of it. She put it on without comment. Outside, the highland air hit her like cold water, clean and sharp, clearing the gilded fog of the ballroom from her lungs. The gravel drive was lit by iron lanterns, and in the distance the dark shapes of the pine forest stood against a sky full of hard northern stars. She stopped on the steps. Rylan stopped beside her. For a moment neither of them spoke. Below the steps, carriages were being brought around, horses stamping in the cold, breath misting in the lamplight. The sounds of the ball continued distantly behind them, the crowd reassembling, the music tentatively resuming, the vast social machinery recalibrating around a new set of facts. "My cart is at the east side of the drive," Aria said. "I know," Rylan said. "My men found it an hour ago." She turned to look at him. He met her gaze without apology. "I came here tonight expecting to see you. I wanted to be certain you had a way out, whatever happened." "You came here expecting to see me," she repeated. "Yes." The night air moved through the pines. A horse shook its mane below them. Aria looked at Rylan Thorne, at this man who had apparently anticipated this evening with a specificity she was only beginning to understand, and felt the ground shift slightly beneath the version of tonight she'd thought she understood. "We need to talk," she said. "We have time," he said. "The road south is long." "We're not going south tonight." A beat. Something moved in his expression. Not resistance, exactly. Recalibration. "Explain," he said. "Mira," she said. "My sister. She's in Ashvin. I won't leave this territory without her." Reelin was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Kael. Kael, who had been standing 6 feet away with the patient stillness of a man content to exist in his own vicinity for extended periods, raised an eyebrow. "Ashvin is 4 miles east," Rylan said. "I know where my village is." Another pause. This one had a different quality than the first. Not hesitation, she realized. He was thinking, actually thinking, turning something over, giving it the attention it warranted before responding. She filed that away too. Then we go to Ashvin first, he said. Adrian from somewhere behind her right shoulder. Obviously, Chan. The cart was where she'd left it. The driver, an older man named Forsyth, who ran a small hiring operation out of Ashvin and had known Aria since she was 8 years old, was asleep on the bench with his hat over his face. He woke when she touched his arm and blinked at her, and then blinked at the 3 large men standing behind her and the horses that were not his, and said, with admirable economy, "Ah!" "I'll pay you double the return fare," Aria said. "Go home." "Right," said Forsyth, and climbed down and went. The ride to Ashvin took 40 minutes in Ryland's carriage, which was dark wood and well-sprung and warm, with lamps that burned steadily in the corners and a silence that was less uncomfortable than she'd expected. Cale sat across from her with his eyes half closed, blood dried at his flank, apparently indifferent to it. Adrian had chosen to ride outside. She suspected because 40 minutes of enforced stillness was not within his operational range. Ryland sat beside her, not quite touching, and said almost nothing for the first 20 minutes. She was grateful for it. At the 20-minute mark, he said, without preamble, "You should know what you're walking into." "Tell me." "The Southern Pack is large, the largest unified wolf territory between the ridge and the coast. 14 settlements, 2 citadels, and an outer range that borders 3 independent packs." He spoke factually, without the kind of territorial pride she would have expected, just information. "It's been mine for 6 years. Before that it was my father's, and before that my grandfather's, and the name Thorn has been the name of that territory for 4 generations." "And you need a queen for it," she said. He looked at her. "I didn't say that." "You implied—" "I implied nothing about need," he said. "I made a claim in that room because I chose to. The territory doesn't require anything of you that you don't choose to give." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's a very convenient thing to say on the way from the ballroom." "I know," he said. "It'll sound less convenient in 6 months." They rode in silence again, then quietly. "How long have you known about me?" He didn't pretend not to understand the question. 2 years, he said. "Approximately." The carriage lamp swayed. The road was rough here, North Road packed earth that froze and thawed with the season and was never entirely smooth. "The Harvest Crossing," she said. 2 years ago." "Yes." "Lucas saw me there." "I know, I was there too." He paused. "He saw you first." "I observed pack law." She stared at him. The sentence landed the way certain sentences land, quietly, and then with increasing weight, like a stone dropped into water whose full depth you hadn't gauged. "You were at the Harvest Crossing," she said slowly. "I was attending the Northern Trade Assembly. The Harvest Crossing fell on the same weekend, and you saw me." "I saw you," he said. "Tell the crossing warden that the bridge levy was 3 marks above its posted rate and that you'd done the calculation yourself and could show him the figures." Something moved in his expression. "And then you showed him the figures, on the back of a flour sack, in chalk." Despite everything, despite the entire weight of the evening, despite the exhaustion and the grief and the strange new territory she was navigating, something in Aria's chest did a small, involuntary thing. "He was overcharging everyone," she said. "Someone had to say it." "Yes," Ryland said. "Someone did." She looked out the window at the dark passing tree line. "You watched me for 2 years," she said. "I monitored the situation," he said, with the precise carefulness of a man who understood the distinction mattered. "That is the same thing." "It is not entirely different," he allowed. "And tonight, you came to the ball knowing what Lucas was going to do." The pause this time was the kind that meant yes. "How?" she asked. Cale opened one eye from his corner. "Pack intelligence," he said, then closed it again. Ryland looked at his brother with the expression of someone who had been preempted and had decided not to litigate it. "Lucas Crane has been in correspondence with the Ashworth family for 14 months, he said. "The Ashworth alliance gives him access to the southern trade routes he needs to consolidate his inheritance. The timing of tonight was never in question." "And you let it happen," Aria said. "I couldn't prevent a man from breaking his own promise. That's his act, his consequence." He met her gaze. "What I could do was be there when it happened." She thought about that. the coal in her palm, dead cold since 11:45. She thought about 2 years of holding something that had already been decided against her, of a man who had known and kept knowing and still let her carry the weight of his lie all the way into that ballroom in her sister's handmade dress. "You could have warned me," she said. Her voice was even. The hurt in it was not. Reelin held her gaze. "Yes," he said. "I could have, and I've considered many times what the right thing to do was." A pause. "I decided that the choice needed to be made in that room, in front of those people by you, not by information I gave you beforehand. If you'd known, you might not have come. And if you hadn't come—" He stopped. "Then what?" "Then I would have respected that," he said quietly. "And you would have spent the rest of your life in Ashvin, wondering what had been possible." The carriage rolled on through the dark. She didn't forgive him for it. Not entirely, not yet. But she understood it, which was a different thing, and in some ways more complicated. What? The cottage was dark when they arrived. Aria was out of the carriage before it had fully stopped, moving up the path with the particular urgency of someone returning home under circumstances that required explanation, and she knocked twice in the pattern she and Mira had used since childhood, 2 sharp, 1 soft, and the door opened almost immediately. Mira stood in the doorway in her sleeping clothes, hair loose, a candle in her hand, and the expression of a woman who had been awake and waiting and preparing herself for news that could fall either way. She looked at Aria, she looked at the ivory dress, the estate cloak, the entirely intact composure of her sister's face. Then she looked past Aria at the carriage on the road, at the 3 men standing at a respectful distance in the dark. "Tell me," Mira said. Aria told her. Quickly, cleanly, without excessive editorializing. The rejection, the Thorne brothers, the contest, the choice. Mira listened with the focused attention of someone absorbing information they're going to need to act on, her candle burning steadily, her face doing a series of rapid small things that Aria recognized as the accelerated processing of an extremely quick mind. When Aria finished, Mira was quiet for a moment. Then, "Which one is the king?" "The large one in the center." Mira looked past her again. Reelin, apparently sensing the attention, looked back. "He has good posture," Mira said. "Mira, I'm observing." She looked back at her sister. "You said yes." "I said yes." "You're sure?" Aria stopped. She thought about it honestly, which Mira always deserved. "I'm as sure as I can be about something I didn't anticipate 24 hours ago. I made the choice with what I had. Yes." Mira looked at her for a long time. She had always been able to see through Aria, had been doing it since they were children, and what she was looking for now, what she was reading in the set of her sister's shoulders, and the steadiness of her voice, and the absence of the specific kind of blankness that Aria's face did when she was suppressing something that needed suppressing, was whether the choice had been made from fear or from something better. Apparently she found her answer. "Give me 20 minutes, she said, and went back inside to pack. Well, they reached the southern road before 2 in the morning. The southern road was different from the northern tracks, wider, better maintained, the consequence of a territory that had invested in its infrastructure with the long-term thinking of a pack that intended to exist for generations. The trees gave way gradually to open highland, moonlit and immense, and for the first time since the ball, Aria felt something loosen in her chest. Not safety, not exactly. Something more like air. Mira, characteristically, had introduced herself to Adrian within the first 20 minutes of travel. Adrian riding inside now, the cold having apparently relocated his preference, and they were deep in conversation about something that involved a great deal of hand gesturing on Adrian's part. Kael was asleep again, or performing sleep so convincingly it made no practical difference. Rylan and Aria sat together at the front of the carriage bench, close enough now that their shoulders occasionally touched on the rougher sections of road. She had questions. She asked them. He answered them. It was, she discovered, the most honest conversation she could remember having with a man in several years, which was a low bar given recent evidence, but was also, in the moment, simply true. She asked about the Southern Pack, its structure, its laws, the way decisions were made, The degree to which pack law and personal authority were distinct. He answered with the specificity of a man who had thought carefully about governance and continued to think about it, who didn't perform certainty about things he found genuinely complex. She asked about his brothers. He told her. Kyle was 2 years younger, had managed the Eastern Citadel for 3 years, was precise and contained in the way of people who have decided that precision is a form of respect. Adrian was 4 years younger, had spent 18 months traveling the outer packs as a diplomatic liaison, was constitutionally incapable of disengaging from any human being he found interesting, which appeared to be most of them. "And your parents?" she asked. "My mother died when Adrian was 6, he said. My father held the pack for 17 years after that and then stepped down when I turned 24. He lives in the Western settlement now. He fishes. He fishes. Extensively." Something warm moved briefly across his face. "He is very serious about the fishing." She looked out at the moonlit highland. The road stretched ahead, south, toward a territory she'd never seen, toward a life she hadn't planned for, toward a set of people who were going to have their own opinions about the woman their king had claimed at a northern ball on 40 Minutes collective acquaintance. "They're not going to accept me," she said. "Some won't," he said. "Initially. More than some." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes, more than some." She appreciated the honesty. She had been living on managed truth for 2 years, and honest bad news landed better than comfortable lies. Always. "What do I do about that?" "Whatever you decide to do," he said. "I'll back you." "You don't know what I'll decide." "No," he said. "That's the point." Okay. They arrived at the first southern settlement, Thorngate, as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. It was not the Citadel, that was another 3 hours south, but it was the gateway town of the Thorn territory, a small fortified settlement built around a crossroads and a trading post, permanently staffed and never quite quiet. The carriage was recognized before it reached the gate. She could see figures moving in the pre-dawn dimness, guards straightening, a gate captain approaching. She could see, too, the exact moment they recognized the carriage and then began looking for the things they expected to see, and then registered the things they didn't. A woman. An unfamiliar woman. At the king's side. Word traveled fast in pack communities. She knew this. She had grown up in one. What started as a gate captain's raised eyebrow would be, by the time they reached the Citadel, a fully formed narrative with details she couldn't predict or control. The gate captain stepped forward as the carriage slowed. He was 40-something, experienced, the kind of man whose face had been trained into professional neutrality, but couldn't quite hold it against genuine surprise. "My Lord Rylan," he said. "We didn't expect you until next week." "Plans changed," Rylan said. He said it simply, without explanation, in the tone that meant the simplicity was the whole answer. "We'll need rooms for tonight. 4 guests." The gate captain's eyes moved to Aria, moved away, moved back, involuntarily. Rylan's voice didn't change. "This is Aria Vale, my mate." The words hit the morning air and stayed there. The gate captain blinked. He had the look of a man running a rapid calculation. The political, social, logistical calculation of someone who understood that what he did in the next 15 seconds was going to be observed and remembered and evaluated. He arrived at a conclusion with admirable speed. "Miss Vale," he said, "welcome to Thorngate. Welcome to Thorn territory." "Thank you," Aria said. He opened the gate. She was still processing the precise sensation of those words, "my mate," said in public, to a stranger, with complete matter-of-fact authority, as the carriage moved through. "You didn't warn me you were going to do that," she said quietly. "You said you'd accepted the claim," Rylan said, "in that room, in front of those people." The gate captain is people. She turned to look at him. He was watching the road ahead, but there was something in the set of his face that was doing the thing she was beginning to recognize, the absence of a smile that was nevertheless a smile. "I'm going to need time to get used to you," she said. "You have time," he said. "The road is long." Thorngate's guest house was warm and clean and smelled of pine resin and something baked earlier in the morning. Aria slept for 4 hours in a bed that was the best bed she had slept in since She thought about it honestly, ever, and woke to pale winter light coming through the window and Mira sitting at the small table by the fire drinking tea and reading a letter that she set face down when Aria stirred. "That was fast," Aria said, meaning the letter. "Adrian's wolves are efficient," Mira said, with the studied neutrality of someone who has more to say on a subject and is organizing it. Aria sat up. "How long have I been asleep?" 4 hours. It's 8 in the morning. Kyle brought bread." Mira pushed a covered plate toward the edge of the table. "And someone named Wren came to ask if you needed anything. She's the housekeeper here. She looked at me very carefully the whole time she was asking, which I think means she was trying to form opinions. But everyone here is going to form opinions." "Yes," Mira agreed. "The question is which ones we help along." Aria got out of bed, crossed to the table, sat down, and pulled the bread toward her. She was, she discovered, completely ravenous. The kind of hungry that only arrives after a very long night of sustained emotional emergency and its accompanying adrenaline. Once the adrenaline has finally, fully cleared. She ate 3 pieces of bread and 2 dried apricots and a small hard cheese before she felt like a person again. Mira watched her eat with the look she got when she had organized her thoughts and was selecting which ones to deploy first. "Say it," Aria said. "He's not what I expected," Mira said. "What did you expect?" "Someone who made you feel like you'd been rescued." Mira turned her teacup in her hands. "He doesn't do that. He treats you like you made a decision, and he's honoring it. It's—" She paused. "It's different." "Yes," Aria said. "It's better," Mira said quietly. They sat with that for a moment. Then Mira said, "There's something you need to know." Her voice had changed. Aria looked up. Mira picked up the letter, the one she'd put face down when Aria woke, and held it out. Aria took it. She read it. It was short, and it was from Councilman Aldrich Voss. And it had been sent by Fast Rider sometime in the early hours of the morning, and it said the following: "The Highland Council convenes an emergency session in 3 days' time. The matter before the council is a formal challenge to the validity of the Moonball claiming, submitted by the Crane Pack, on grounds that the claimant, Aria Vale of Ashfin, does not meet the residency requirements of the Highland Accord for a contested claim to stand. If the challenge succeeds, the claim by Ryland Thorne is nullified under Northern law. You are named as a party. Your presence at the council session is required." Aria read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and looked at the fire. "Lucas," she said. "Lucas," Mira confirmed. She thought about it. She thought about it carefully, working through the layers. The legal question, which she didn't fully understand yet. The political question, which she understood very well. And the deeper question underneath both, which was the simplest and most dangerous of the 3. Lucas Crane had lost the contest. He had lost in front of 200 people, in front of the council, in front of his new claiming, Celestine Ashworth, who would have opinions about the way the evening had complicated itself. He had lost his ability to manage the narrative about what he'd done to Aria, because the presence of the Thorne brothers and the contest and the claiming had transformed the evening from Lucas moves on into Lucas was defeated in front of everyone. And powerful men who have been publicly defeated do not quietly absorb the lesson. They find a mechanism. The residency requirement for a contested claim. She was thinking fast now, reading the pack law as she'd understood it from years of proximity to its edges, applied to the rejected party in a simultaneous claim situation. Which meant the challenge was arguing that because she wasn't a full-standing member of the Northern Pack hierarchy, the contest itself was invalid. Which meant that everything that had happened in that ballroom could be unwound. Which meant that Lucas still had a play. "He knows I don't have pack standing," she said. "You have birth right in Ashfin," Mira said. "That's Northern territory." Ashfin is an independent village settlement. It's within the Northern Range, but it's not formally affiliated with a pack structure. She looked at the letter. He knows that. He's always known that. He probably factored it in years ago. Mira was quiet. "He used me as a backup," Aria said, and her voice was very flat and very clear. 2 years. He kept me as a contingency. If the Ashworth alliance fell through, he had me. And if he needed to dispose of me cleanly, my lack of standing was always going to be the mechanism. The fire crackled. Are you going to tell Rylan? Mira asked. He probably already knows, Aria said. The letter came to me at his guest house. His people screened it before delivering it. She stood. I'm going to talk to him. Aria. Mira's voice was careful again, the careful voice, the asking without asking voice. What are you going to do? Aria picked up the letter. She looked at it one more time. The clean, formal lines of Aldrich's handwriting, the 3 days, the challenge, the nullification of everything the night before had built. I'm going to go to that council session, she said. You're going south with Rylan. He said the road south is long. She folded the letter. He didn't say I had to go south first. Rylan read the letter standing, the way he did most things, with stillness that wasn't static, with an attention that was absolute and not at all comfortable to be the object of, if you were the subject of the document he was reading. When he finished, he set it on the table. You knew, she said. My rider arrived an hour ahead of Aldrich's, he said. Yes. And you were going to tell me when you woke up, he said. Over breakfast. I was going to tell you over breakfast. He met her gaze. I didn't want you to wake up to it. She absorbed that, filed it. The residency argument, she said. Is it valid? Under a strict reading of the accord, it has merit. He was precise about it, giving her the real answer. Ashfin's independent status is documented. Whether it constitutes sufficient Northern Pact standing for a contested claim is an interpretive question the Council can rule on either way. What are the odds? Without political pressure, it's close. Aldrich is fair. But the Crane Pack has 3 council seats and the Ashworth family has 2. That's 5 of 9 votes before the session even begins. He paused. With political pressure, the outcome is not good. She looked at him. Then we're going north. Yes, he said. We're going north. A beat. Kyle and Adrian come, he said. I'll send riders ahead to the Citadel. We leave within the hour. She nodded and turned to go. Aria. She stopped. The challenge isn't really about the residency question, he said. You know that. I know, she said. It's about what Lucas needs to be true, about whether I can be made to disappear quietly enough that the story he tells about last night becomes the only story. Rylan looked at her across the small, warm room of the Thorngate guest house, in the pale morning light, with the letter on the table between them and 3 days before a council session that could undo everything. He's going to find, Rylan said quietly, that you're difficult to make disappear. She thought about her sister sewing by candlelight. She thought about chalk figures on a flour sack at a harvest crossing. She thought about standing in the center of a ballroom in a handmade dress with 200 people watching and lifting her chin and refusing to be reduced. He's going to find that, she agreed. She left the room. Behind her, she heard Rylan call for Kyle in the tone that meant now and fully armored. The morning light was cold and clear. The southern road stretched one way, the northern road the other. She turned north. 3 days. A council of 9. A legal argument designed to erase her. And Lucas Crane, who had spent 2 years learning the shape of her patience, betting that she would fold under formal pressure the way she hadn't folded under personal humiliation. He had miscalculated her once already. She was about to let him discover exactly how expensive that habit was. The road north was harder in daylight. Not the road itself. The packed earth and the frost-heaved gravel were no worse than they'd been in the dark hours going south. What was harder was the visibility. In daylight, you could see the territory you were moving through, the distances involved, the scale of a landscape that didn't particularly care what happened to the small human arrangements being made across its surface. You could see the northern ridge rising against the winter sky, gray and indifferent, and understand viscerally that the warmth of the Thorngate guest house was already behind you, and the council chamber was still ahead, and the 3 days between now and then were going to require something from you that hadn't been fully named yet. Aria sat in the carriage with her spine straight and the letter in her coat pocket and thought about pack law. She had grown up at the edges of it. In Ashfin, pack law was ambient, present the way weather was present, structuring the conditions of daily life without requiring constant direct engagement, until it did. She had watched her mother navigate the fine print of independent village standing for 30 years, the way certain rights attached to pack affiliation and didn't extend to settlements like Ashfin, the way disputes that would have been resolved quickly inside a formal pack structure dragged for months in the gray space of independent village status, the way people with pack names looked at people without them and performed the specific social math that determined, in every room, who was real and who was approximate. She knew the mechanism Lucas was using. She understood it from the inside out. What she needed to understand was whether she could beat it. "Tell me the exact language," she said. Rylan, seated across from her, had been watching the road through the window. He turned. "Which section?" "The residency requirement, the exact words." He looked at her for a moment with the quality of attention she was becoming familiar with, the kind that was actually assessing, not performing assessment. Then he said, "Article 9 of the Highland Accord. A contested claim arising from simultaneous declarations before pack witnesses requires that the subject of the claim hold recognized standing within the territorial jurisdiction in which the claiming occurred. Standing is defined as current pack membership, documented birthright within a formally affiliated settlement, or continuous documented residence of not less than 3 years within the territorial boundary." He said it from memory. She filed that separately. The fact that he had memorized pack law and the specific articles and had been carrying this one in particular since the letter arrived. She turned the language over in her mind, parsed it, tested it. 3 sections, she said. Pack membership. I don't have that. Formally affiliated settlement. Ashfin isn't formally affiliated, Lucas knows that. But the 3rd section. She looked up. Continuous documented residence of not less than 3 years within the territorial boundary. "You've lived in Ashfin your entire life," Ryland said. "Ashfin is within the Northern Territorial Boundary," she said. "It's not affiliated with a pack, but it's within the boundary. The question is whether territorial boundary means the Northern Pack territory as a whole, or specifically the affiliated settlement zone." Something shifted in Ryland's expression. Small and quick, but she caught it. "That's the interpretive question," he said. "That's the exact point the council is going to rule on. And Crane's 5 votes will argue it means affiliated settlements only. Yes. And the 4 remaining votes. Aldrich's is unaligned. The other 3 belong to smaller northern packs. The Voss family, the Heron clan, and the Greymount settlement." He paused. "Greymount is independent, not formally affiliated with the main pack structure." She looked at him. "Greymount's council seat was granted as a compromise during the border consolidation 40 years ago," he said. "It was a territorial concession, recognition that settlements within the boundary but outside formal affiliation still had standing in council matters." The carriage rolled over a rough patch of road. The lamp swayed. "So, 40 years ago," Aria said slowly, "the council itself recognized that territorial boundary and formal affiliation are not the same thing." "The Greymount seat exists specifically because of that distinction," Ryland said. "And the sitting Greymount council member is a woman named Councilwoman Dara Greymount, 63 years old, has held the seat for 20 years. Her settlement has been fighting off absorption by the main pack structure for most of that time." He met her gaze. "She understands, better than anyone on that council, what it costs to be told your standing doesn't count." The silence between them had a different quality now, denser, more purposeful. "You've been thinking about this since the letter arrived," she said. "Since before," he said. "Since the moment I understood what Lucas was going to do at the ball. The residency challenge was always going to be his fallback. You prepared for it." "I prepared for the possibility." He was precise about it, the way he was precise about most things. "I didn't want to need it." She looked at him across the carriage. This man she had known for less than 12 hours, who had watched her from a distance for 2 years, and apparently spent a portion of that time working through the legal architecture of scenarios she hadn't even known were possible. "When we get to the council," she said, "I want to make the argument myself." He was quiet. "I know what you're going to say," she told him. "You don't know what I'm going to say," he said. "You're going to say that you have legal counsel, that the Southern Pack has resources for this, that there's no tactical reason for me to speak when trained advocates could—" "I was going to say," Ryland said, "that if you want to make the argument yourself, I'll make sure you have everything you need to do it." She stopped. He looked at her steadily. "I told you that your voice stays yours. I meant it in the ballroom. I mean it here." A pause. "Do you need a copy of the full accord text?" She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Yes," she said. "And the Greymount border consolidation records from 40 years ago, if you have them." "Kael." Rylan raised his voice toward the carriage wall. From outside, Kael's voice, entirely unsurprised. "Already requested. Ryder went to the Citadel archive an hour ago. The documents will meet us at Thorngate's northern relay point." Adrian's voice, cheerfully from the same direction. "He prepared that too. He prepares everything. It's exhausting to witness." Aria looked at Rylan. Rylan looked out the window with the expression of a man coexisting with his brothers. She almost smiled. She didn't, quite. But the thing in her chest that had been cold and tight since the letter arrived shifted, fractionally, towards something that had more oxygen in it. They stopped at the northern relay point, a small stone post station where horses were changed and messages exchanged between the territory and the outer settlements, at mid-morning. The archive documents were there, brought by a rider who had made very good time and looked appropriately proud of it. Aria took the documents into the station's small side room and read for 2 hours. Mira sat with her for the first hour, following along in silence, and then said, with the economy of someone who has absorbed information and knows what to do with it, "The Greymount Concession Agreement of the 43rd year, Section 4, Paragraph 2. Read it." Aria found it, read it. In recognition that the territorial boundary of the Northern Pack Range encompasses settlements of varied affiliation status, the Council herein affirms that residency within the territorial boundary shall constitute standing for the purposes of Council representation and Pack law proceedings, without requirement of formal Pack membership or settlement affiliation. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time, carefully. The way you read something when you want to be absolutely certain you haven't misunderstood it because you need it to say what you think it says. It said what she thought it said. "Mira," she said. "I know," Mira said. "This isn't an interpretive argument. This is a direct precedent. 40 years ago, the Council explicitly defined territorial boundary residency as sufficient for Pack law standing, independent of formal affiliation." "And Ashfin is within the territorial boundary," Mira said. "And I was born there and have lived there continuously for 22 years. "Which is not less than 3 years, Mira said. Aria set the document down on the table. She pressed her palm flat against it, steadily, like she was making sure it was real. "He didn't know about this," she said. "Lucas, he researched the residency requirement and he found the affiliation language and he stopped there because it looked like enough." She thought about it. "He didn't dig into the concession records because they're 40 years old and he didn't think he needed to. He thought he was using a clean mechanism." "He was sloppy," Mira said. "He was overconfident," Aria said. "There's a difference. Sloppy people miss things because they're not paying attention. Overconfident people miss things because they've already decided they're right." She picked up the document. "He decided he was right before he finished reading." Mira looked at her with the expression she saved for moments when she was proud of her sister, and wanted to say so without making it ceremonious. "Go tell Rylan," she said. The remaining day and a half before the Council session moved, the way time moves in the hours before something decisive, with a compression that made individual moments feel simultaneously too fast and too slow, as though the clock were running at normal speed but experience had expanded to notice things it usually passed over. The group made good time north. By late afternoon of the first day they were back in Highland country, the pine forest thickening on either side of the road, the air sharpening with altitude and the particular cold that the northern ridge held even in the mildest winters. They stopped at a way station before dark, and Aria spent 3 hours with the documents and a piece of paper, building her argument the way she'd built arguments her whole life, from the materials available, with the precision that came from not being able to afford mistakes. Rylan checked in once, in the evening, with a plate of food she'd forgotten to seek out and a question about whether she needed additional sources. "The original Accord drafting notes," she said without looking up. "If they exist." "They exist," he said. "They're in the Citadel archive. Adrian's already writing for them." How did you know I'd want the drafting notes? You've been reading the concession records for the precedent, he said. The strongest version of the argument links the original intent of the boundary language to its application 40 years later. Drafting notes establish intent. She looked up from her papers. He was standing in the doorway of the way station's small room, and the lamplight was behind him, and he was watching her with the full, quiet attention that she had stopped finding disconcerting approximately 6 hours ago, and had started finding, instead, something she didn't have a precise word for. Stabilizing, perhaps. The particular stability of being seen clearly by someone who wasn't afraid of what they were seeing. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "Tell me about the council members," she said. "Each one. What they want, what they're afraid of, what they consider a good argument versus what they consider a threat." He told her. He was precise and unsentimental about it. No flattery, no political spin, just the clean facts of 9 people and their positions and the calculations they were likely to be making in the days before the session. She listened and asked questions and made notes and asked more questions, and outside the way station window the northern night deepened around them, cold and absolute. At some point Mira appeared in the doorway, looked at the two of them at the table covered in documents and notes, and went away again without a word. Aria registered this dimly and filed it. At midnight, Ryland said, "You should sleep." "I'm not finished." "You know the argument," he said. "You've known it for 6 hours. You're refining past the point of improvement." She looked at her notes. He was probably right. He had the infuriating quality of being right about practical things with the same quiet certainty he brought to everything else, which left no good opening for disagreement. "What if Aldrich rules against the precedent before I can finish the argument?" she said. "He won't," Ryland said. "How do you know?" "Because Aldrich has been a fair interpreter of pack law for 40 years, and the precedent is sound, and he knows it." A pause. "And because he sent you the letter personally, when he could have sent it through Lucas's legal counsel, and the letter was written in a way that made sure you had 3 full days to prepare." He held her gaze. "He gave you time, Aria. He did that deliberately." She thought about the letter, the clean, careful lines of it, the specific information it contained, the legal grounds of the challenge, the timeline, the named parties. More information than a simple summons required. "He wants me to come prepared," she said. "I think," Ryland said carefully, "that Aldrich Voss has been watching the Crane Air for a number of years and has his own opinions about the events of the Moonball. And I think his opinions are not uncomplicated." He paused. "I also think that a council elder who has spent 40 years maintaining the independence of institutions has a specific interest in seeing precedent upheld over political pressure." She absorbed that. Then she put down her pen. "I'm going to sleep," she said. "Good," he said. "You're not going to say anything about the fact that I just took your advice." "I'm going to say nothing about it at all," he said, and there was the smile again, the quiet, real one, and she took it with her when she went. The council chamber at Cravenhold occupied the east wing of the estate, a different room from the ballroom, smaller and colder and stripped of decoration, with a long stone table and 9 chairs and the specifically uncomfortable atmosphere of rooms designed to make the people inside them feel the weight of consequences. They arrived with 40 minutes to spare before the session was called to order. The anteroom was occupied. Lucas Crane, with 2 legal advocates from the Northern Pack hierarchy, and Celestine Ashworth seated behind him with the careful composure of a woman performing supportive attendance. Representatives from the Voss and Heron packs clustered together and speaking quietly. Councilwoman Dara Greymount, alone, reading something, who looked up when Aria entered and gave her a look of assessment so direct it was almost aggressive. Aria looked back at her, equally direct, and did not look away first. Something moved in Dara Greymount's expression. She returned to her reading. Lucas looked up when Aria entered. The color in his face changed, not dramatically, not in a way the room could have mapped without looking for it, but she was looking for it and she saw it. He had expected her to be uncertain. He had expected, she thought, the version of Aria Vale that he'd spent 2 years constructing in his mind. The patient village girl. The one who held promises and waited and folded under formal pressure because she didn't have the standing or the resources or the connections to push back. He looked at the documents under her arm. He looked at Rylan, behind her. He looked at Kael. He looked, lastly, at her face. She watched him recalibrate. It took 3 seconds. One of his advocates leaned close and said something. Lucas shook his head slightly and looked away. The session was called to order at the designated hour. Aldrich Voss sat at the center of the council table, the permanent chair of the Highland Council, which he had occupied for 20 years. He looked, in this room, more formidable than he had at the ball. Stripped of the evening social theater, in the plain wool coat of a working council session, he was simply what he was, a man who had made careful decisions for a long time and trusted himself to make more. He opened the session without ceremony. The matter before the council is a formal challenge to the validity of the moonball claiming submitted by the Crane Pack on grounds of residency. He looked at Lucas's advocates. The challenge is entered. One of the advocates, a lean man in his 40s with the polished diction of someone educated in formal pack law, stood and presented the argument. It was competent. It was well organized. It cited Article 9 of the Highland Accord with precision and moved logically through the definition of standing toward the conclusion that Ashvin's independent status meant Aria Vale lacked the formal affiliation required for a contested claim. He spoke for 18 minutes. Several council members took notes. Aldrich listened with the ice-pale attention he brought to everything. When the advocate finished, Aldrich said, "The named party has the right of response under council rules. Miss Vale." Aria stood. The room had its attention on her in the way rooms do when they have already formed opinions about what they're going to see and are waiting to be confirmed. She recognized the feeling. She had lived inside it for most of her life. She set her documents on the table. "Councilman Aldrich, members of the council," she said. "The challenge before you turns on a single interpretive question, whether the residency requirement of Article 9, Section 3 of the Highland Accord applies to the Northern Territorial Boundary as a whole, or only to formally affiliated settlements within that boundary." She paused, clear, steady, unhurried. "I submit that this question was already answered by this council 40 years ago in the Greymount Border Consolidation Concession Agreement." She found the document. She read the relevant section aloud. The precise language, the explicit definition, the council's own 40-year-old statement of exactly the principle the challenge was asking them to rule against. The room was very still. She continued. She had the drafting notes, the original language discussions from the Accord's creation, in which the boundary definition had been deliberately written to include unaffiliated settlements precisely because the council of that era had understood that formal affiliation and territorial belonging were not identical categories. She read the relevant passages. She cited the Greymount concession as the practical application of that principle. Then she set the drafting notes down and looked at the 9 council members. "I was born in Ashvin," she said. "I have lived there for 22 years. Ashvin is within the Northern Territorial Boundary. Under the explicit precedent established by this council and affirmed in the Greymount concession, territorial boundary residency constitutes standing for pack law proceedings without requirement of formal affiliation." She picked up the last document. A simple, single page she had written herself the previous night, by lamplight, with the same care Mira used on a seam. "This is a residency record from Ashvin's village register," she said. "My name, my birth year, the date of continuous residence, 22 years. She placed it on the table. "I have standing." She sat down. The room remained still for a long moment. Then Lucas Crane's lead advocate was on his feet. "The Greymount concession addresses council representation, not pack law claiming procedures. The specific application to—" "The concession text says pack law proceedings," Aria said. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Those are the exact words, not council representation, pack law proceedings. The intent of the language—" "The drafting notes are in front of the council," she said. "They document the intent. The intent was explicit." The advocate looked at his papers. He was looking for the counterargument. She could see it, the specific quality of stillness that people have when they're searching for something and becoming increasingly aware it might not be there. Aldrich spoke. "Councilwoman Greymount," he said, "your settlement standing before this council derives from the concession in question. In your interpretation, does the language of the concession distinguish between council representation and PAC law proceedings?" Dara Greymount set down what she was holding. She looked at Aldrich, then at Lucas, then at Aria. The look she gave Aria lasted exactly long enough to be deliberate. "It does not," she said. "The language is general, PAC law proceedings. That phrase, in the standard interpretation of this council's documents, encompasses the full range of PAC law application, not specific subcategories." One of the Heron clan representatives shifted in his seat. Aldrich looked at the Voss family representative. "Councilman Voss." Petra Voss's relative, a man of 50 with the same broad northern features, cleared his throat. "The language is as Councilwoman Greymount describes," he said carefully. "General application." Lucas's advocate made one more attempt, citing a minority interpretation from a secondary treaty document. It was good work. It was the best available work built on the materials the challenge had given him. But it was built on incomplete foundation, and the council could see it, and watching a well-constructed argument collapse under the weight of a better precedent was something that happened in rooms like this one and left a specific, undeniable silence in its wake. Aldrich looked at the room. He looked at each council member in turn, the slow pan of a man taking a final reading before committing to a conclusion. Then he looked at Aria. "The council finds," he said, "that the residency requirement of Article 9 is satisfied under the Greymount precedent. The contested claim arising from the moonball is valid under Northern PAC law. The challenge is dismissed." The room exhaled. Lucas Crane was very still. His advocates were quiet. Celestine Ashworth was looking at her hands. Dara Greymount was looking at Aria, and the expression on her face was not warmth. She was not a warm person, Aria suspected, by either nature or long experience. But it was something that lived in the same neighborhood. It was the expression of a woman who had spent 40 years defending a principle and had just watched someone else use it correctly in a fight it was built for. It was recognition. Aria held her gaze and nodded, once. Dara Greymount returned it. Aldrich was speaking still. The formal language of the ruling, the documentation requirements, the implications for the record. She heard it from a slight distance, the way you hear things when the most urgent portion of your attention is occupied by the simple physical experience of still being here, still standing, still, against the entire machinery of a challenge designed to remove her in possession of her own name. Rylan was behind her. He hadn't spoken during the session. She had asked him not to, and he had honored that completely, which she had not taken for granted. She could feel his presence now the way she'd learned in the last 2 days to feel it. Steady, contained, directed at her without pressure. She turned, after the session formally closed, and looked at him. He looked back at her. He didn't say "I told you so," or "well done," or any of the things that would have reduced what had just happened to something he'd predicted or managed. He didn't say anything, actually. He simply looked at her with that full, quiet attention, and what was in it was uncomplicated and entirely genuine. She thought, for the first time since the morning of the moonball, about the conversation she'd had with Mira by lamplight while the ivory dress was being assembled. "Do you think he'll actually do it?" Mira had asked, and what Aria had said was he has no reason to lie, and what Mira had correctly identified was that it wasn't the same as believing him. She thought about what it felt like to believe something, not the coal in the palm kind, the kind held by will, the kind that was more about refusing to stop than about actual faith. The other kind. The kind that was quieter and less effortful, and arrived not because you decided to have it, but because the evidence accumulated past the point where it could be argued away. Lucas Crane had given her 2 years of managed truth, and a promise he'd made with no intention of keeping. Rylan Thorne had known her for 2 days and had backed her, completely, in the room that mattered most, and let her do it herself. The evidence was accumulating. "Ready?" he said. She picked up her documents from the council table. She straightened. She turned to face the room, which still contained Lucas and his advocates and the 9 council members and the high stone walls and the cold light of a northern winter afternoon. She walked through it. "Ready?" she said. Behind her, the council chamber door opened onto the corridor, and beyond the corridor the estate's front hall, and beyond that, The highland afternoon, bright and cold and enormous, with the southern road running all the way to the horizon. The challenge was dismissed. The claiming stood. She had standing. She had always had it. Now the law agreed. She had always had it. Now the law agreed. The corridor outside the council chamber was long and stone-floored and lit by tall windows that let in the flat, clean light of a northern winter afternoon. Aria walked the length of it with Rylan beside her and Mira and Kyle and Adrian behind, and the sound of their footsteps on the stone was the only sound for a long moment. Steady, purposeful, the sound of people moving away from something toward something else. She didn't speak until they reached the front hall. Then she stopped, because her legs had decided, apparently without consulting her, that they needed a moment. Not weakness, nothing so dramatic. More the way a drawn bowstring feels when it's finally released, the sudden absence of sustained tension that the body has been holding so long it forgot it was holding anything. She put one hand on the stone wall beside her. Mira was there immediately, not with words, just with presence, standing close, one hand briefly on her sister's back, warm and solid and entirely Mira. "I'm fine," Aria said. "I know you are," Mira said. "I'm standing here anyway." Adrian had stopped a few feet away and was looking at the ceiling with the elaborate casualness of a man pretending he wasn't watching something private. Kale was simply standing, patient and undemonstrative as always, present in the way he was always present, without pressure, without comment, available if required. Rylan waited. She took 3 breaths. She felt the tension metabolize, not disappear but change form, as sustained pressures do when the immediate cause resolves and the body begins the slow accounting of what it cost. She had been running on cold clarity and preparation and the specific focused energy of a woman who cannot afford to stop moving since 2 a.m. of the previous day. And now the council had ruled and the challenge was dismissed and the claiming stood and her body had opinions about all of that. She straightened. "How far to the southern border?" she asked. Rylan said, 3 hours by carriage, 2 if we move. "Then let's move," she said. But they were almost to the carriages when Lucas found her. She had expected it. She had known, sitting in the council chamber while Aldrich delivered the ruling, that Lucas Crane was not finished, not because he had further legal mechanisms, but because men like Lucas didn't end things cleanly. They didn't close doors. They left them ajar, because closing a door required admitting you'd been in the room and that the room was over, and Lucas had spent 2 years building a version of himself that never lost anything. Not really. Not permanently. He came across the estate's front courtyard with the careful, measured pace of a man who wanted to appear to be in control of his own approach. He had changed his coat since the session, or someone had arranged for him to change it, more likely. And his shoulder, where Kyle had bitten him during the contest, was no longer visibly favored but still held slightly wrong, the residual of an injury being managed rather than resolved. He stopped at a distance that was too far for private conversation and too close to be accidental. "Aria," he said. She looked at him. His advocates were not with him. Celestine was not with him. He had come alone, which told her something, that whatever he intended to say, he'd decided it couldn't be witnessed by people whose opinion of him still mattered to him professionally. "Lucas," she said. Rylan was behind her to the right. He didn't move forward. She didn't look back to check. She simply knew, the way she had begun, over the last 48 hours, to develop a spatial awareness of him that felt less learned than instinctive. He would stay exactly where he was unless she needed him not to. Lucas looked at her with the expression of a man sorting through available options in real time and finding them all insufficient. The easy confidence was gone. Not replaced by anything worse, exactly, but gone. And what was underneath it was younger and less polished and more human than anything she'd seen on his face in 2 years. "You made your argument well," he said. She waited. "The Greymount precedent." He said it like he was turning it over. "I didn't find that." "No," she said. "I should have." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the courtyard held its cold, bright stillness. The horses, the carriages, the distant sound of the estate's ordinary operations continuing undisturbed by the things that had happened inside it over the past 4 days. I made a decision about tonight, he said. The ball, about the claiming, about... He stopped. Tried again. I made calculations about what was practical, what the pack needed, what alliances... Lucas, she said. He stopped. I know, she said. I knew, I think, for longer than I admitted to myself. You made calculations and I was part of them, and eventually I stopped being the most useful part, and you moved to the next one. She kept her voice even. Not cold. She didn't have the energy for cold, and it wasn't what she wanted to convey anyway. I'm not asking you to explain it. I understand the math. He looked at her, and something in his expression broke open briefly. Not dramatically, not with the theatrical quality she might have predicted from him a week ago, but genuinely, the way things break when the performance is too costly to maintain. I thought you'd be all right, he said quietly. Eventually. You thought I'd go home and manage, she said, because that's what I'd always done. That's what people like me do, in your experience. We manage. Yes, he said, very quietly. You weren't entirely wrong, she said. I would have managed. I'm very good at it. She looked at him directly. But you were wrong about what it would cost, and you were wrong about the fact that managing and being all right are the same thing. He held her gaze. He didn't argue. She gave him credit for that. I'm sorry, he said. She considered it. The words. The weight of them, or the weight available to them, which was complicated by 2 years of history and a moonball and a council chamber and everything in between. I believe you, she said. That doesn't change anything. But I believe you. It was more than he deserved and less than he'd wanted, and exactly what she had available, and she gave it to him cleanly, without ceremony, the way you give things when you've decided to stop carrying them. He nodded, once. He looked past her at Rylan, a look she didn't turn to watch but registered in the change of his posture, and then looked back at her. He's going to take good care of you, Lucas said. It wasn't quite a question. He's going to take me seriously, she said. That's what I needed. It turns out those aren't the same thing either. Something moved across Lucas Crane's face, the specific expression of a man understanding, too late and too completely, the precise nature of what he'd had and chosen not to value. She had spent 2 years hoping for his recognition, waiting for him to see her the way she'd believed, at the Harvest Crossing, that he'd seen her. She had been wrong about what he'd seen. She had been right, she thought, about what was possible, about the fact of being visible to someone, seen clearly and valued for it. She hadn't been wrong about that. She'd only been wrong about the someone. Take care of yourself, Lucas, she said. She turned and walked to the carriage. She did not look back. Mum. They crossed the southern border as the sun was beginning its descent, the light going amber and long across the highland, and the territory that opened up before them was different in the way that territories shaped by different hands are different. Not dramatically, not in the space of a visible line, but in the accumulated details of how people had managed the land where they'd built and what they'd planted, and the subtle evidence of long-term intention in the way the roads were maintained and the settlements were positioned relative to each other and the water. It was, she would understand gradually, a territory that had been governed by someone who thought in generations. The citadel appeared an hour after the border, built into the southern ridge the way Cravenhold was built into the northern highland, but differently. Where Cravenhold had the ornate, self-conscious grandeur of a house that knew it was being watched, the Thorn Citadel had the solidity of a structure designed for actual use. Dark stone, yes, and tall, yes, but proportioned for function as much as impression, with gates that looked like they'd been used in actual defense at some point in the not-too-distant past, and outbuildings that clearly served genuine purposes rather than aesthetic ones. It's not beautiful, Ryland said, watching her look at it through the carriage window. In the way Cravenhold is beautiful. No, she agreed. It's real, she said. That's better. He was quiet for a moment, then, yes, that's the right word for it. The Citadel received them the way it received everything, she would later understand, with competent efficiency and zero performance. The gate captain here was not the same kind of creature as Thorngate's post commander. She was a woman of 35 named Sarah, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed, who looked at Aria with the direct, assessing attention of someone whose job was assessment and who intended to do her job regardless of who was watching. "My Lord Rylan," Sarah said. "Welcome back." She looked at Aria. "Miss Vale?" "Aria," Aria said. Sarah blinked. "Aria," she said, with the slight adjustment of a person recalibrating to new information in real time. Then, with a nod that was clean and without theater, "Welcome to the Thorn Citadel." The household staff materialized, organized, swift, the specific choreography of a well-run establishment receiving its governing family after an absence. Aria watched them and was watched by them. The mutual assessment entirely mutual and entirely understood by everyone involved. Mira was given a room 2 doors down from Aria's. The rooms were in the east wing, not the grandest wing, but the warmest, facing the protected courtyard rather than the exposed highland wind, a choice she would later recognize as specific and considered. Her room was large, plain-walled, with a fireplace already lit and a window overlooking the courtyard below. Someone had placed a small vase of dried winter berries on the table by the window. Not a grand gesture, just a small human one, the kind that cost almost nothing and communicated something the grand gestures often didn't. She stood in the center of the room for a long moment. She thought about the cottage in Ashfin, the cracked window glass, the smoking chimney, the lamplight at 2 a.m, and Mira cross-legged on the floor with a needle between her teeth. She thought about it without grief, which surprised her, with something more like the specific clarity of a person looking at the place they came from far enough away to see it whole. She had loved that cottage. She had been formed by it. She was taking it with her. She unpacked her small bag. She hadn't had time or resources for more than a small bag, on a night that was supposed to end differently than it had, and she hung the ivory dress in the wardrobe, where it occupied its hook with the same simple dignity it had carried through everything, and she washed her face in the basin of warm water that had appeared on the dresser, and she felt for the first time in several days that she was in a location rather than in transit. That was something. The first weeks at the Citadel were the hardest. She had known they would be. She had prepared for it, in the way she prepared for things, by thinking through clearly what was coming and deciding in advance not to pretend otherwise. The household was polite. The household was professional. The household was doing the careful arithmetic of a community that had a new permanent member and was working out what that meant for the equilibrium they'd established. And the arithmetic was visible in every interaction she had for the first 10 days. She understood it. She didn't take it personally. She also didn't wait for it to resolve on its own. She asked questions. Persistent, specific, practical questions. About how the Citadel was provisioned, about the outer settlement supply routes, about the winter management of the eastern border roads that Kyle had mentioned in passing on the trip south. She listened to answers with the same focused attention she'd brought to the council chamber documents. She remembered names. She remembered the details people mentioned in passing. Children's names, a bad harvest in the northern settlement, a drainage problem in the second courtyard that had been ongoing for 2 seasons. And she asked follow-up questions the next time she saw those people, because she had grown up in a community where resources were limited, and the way you demonstrated that you understood that was by treating the information people gave you as worth retaining. The household noticed. Not dramatically. It wasn't a moment. It was a gradual shift, like the difference between a room at dawn and a room at mid-morning. The same space, different quality of light. Sarah, the gate captain, was the first. On the 12th day, she fell into step beside Aria in the main courtyard and said, without preamble, "The Eastern Road drainage issue. I've been trying to get it addressed for 2 seasons. The problem is the funding comes from the Citadel allocation and Kyle's Eastern Citadel allocation, and neither allocation wants to carry the full cost." Aria considered it. Whose jurisdiction does the road fall under? That's the problem. It's on the boundary. Then propose a split allocation under a joint maintenance designation, Aria said. If neither side wants to claim full jurisdiction, give them a mechanism to share it without either one losing face. Draft it as a precedent for future boundary infrastructure. Make it useful beyond this specific situation so both sides have a reason to adopt it. Sarah looked at her. "I'm not familiar with the Citadel's administrative structure yet," Aria added, "so correct me if that's not how things work here." "That's exactly how things work here," Sarah said, with the expression of someone who has just received a useful tool from an unexpected direction. "I'll draft it. She did. The drainage issue was resolved within a month. Sarah began stopping to talk to Aria in the courtyard with the regularity of someone who had added a resource to their operational map and intended to continue using it. Others followed. Slowly, and then less slowly, and then with the momentum that social recognition builds when it reaches critical mass. Not adoration, not the theatrical acceptance of someone being welcomed in a ceremony, but the practical, genuine acknowledgement of people who had assessed a new member of their community and found her useful and present and honest, and had adjusted their behavior accordingly. Rylan watched it happen. He didn't comment on it to her directly. He was not a man who narrated things she could observe herself, but she caught him, occasionally, with an expression that was the quiet version of something much larger. Satisfaction, maybe. Or vindication. Or the particular feeling of watching a prediction confirmed that you'd been holding for a long time without being able to share it. They were still learning each other in those first weeks. That was honest and accurate. They were still doing the intricate, essential work of two people figuring out how they actually functioned in close proximity, as opposed to how they'd functioned under the extreme conditions of their first 48 hours together. She discovered that he woke early and was quiet in the mornings, in a way that wasn't distance but was simply how he started his days, and she adapted to it without difficulty because she was the same way. She discovered that he had a specific and considerable impatience with bureaucratic delay that he managed with visible effort and not always complete success, and that the people who worked with him had learned to preemptively address the delays he was most likely to encounter because the alternative was a version of quiet that was less comfortable than it appeared. She discovered that he read constantly, histories primarily, and pack law texts, and the kind of detailed administrative records that most people in his position would have delegated to advisors. She asked him about it once, early on, when she found him at the Citadel's main table at 10 in the evening, with 3 open volumes and a map weighted down at the corners with a carved stone wolf she'd already identified as his primary desk object. "You do it all yourself," she said. "Not all of it," he said. "Most of it. Enough of it." He looked up. "If you don't understand it, you can't govern it. And if you can't govern it, you're not actually in charge. You're a figurehead above people who are." She thought about that. "Your father did the same." "My father built the infrastructure. I'm maintaining it." He paused. "I'm hoping to expand it." "What kind of expansion?" He told her. She sat down. The conversation lasted 2 hours and covered the outer settlement access routes, the trade relationship with 3 independent packs on the eastern boundary, and a land management approach she'd never heard of that he'd encountered in a history of a coastal pack from 60 years prior and had been thinking about adapting for the southern highland terrain. She had ideas. She gave them. He took them seriously, not with the flattery of a man performing openness to impress, but with the actual engagement of someone who had identified a mind he found useful and intended to use it, in the best sense of that word. He pushed back on 2 of her suggestions. She pushed back on his pushback. They arrived somewhere better than either starting position. She walked back to the East Wing that night, understanding something more completely than she had before, that what she had entered, in accepting Rylan Thorne's claim in that ballroom, was not rescue. It was not a removal from the life she'd been living into a better one, the way a woman in a story gets carried out of difficulty by a stronger hand. What she had entered was a partnership, of the particular kind that is the rarest and most durable, the kind built between 2 people who have both, separately, become exactly themselves, and have found that those 2 selves fit together in the specific interlocking way that makes each one more effective than they were alone. She had not known that was possible. She was learning that it was. Mira fell in love with Adrian on a Tuesday in the 5th week, as far as Aria could determine. The exact moment was probably not a Tuesday, and probably not a single moment, because that was not how Mira worked. Mira was deliberate and precise, and did not give her trust or her affection in single dramatic gestures, but in the slow, careful accumulation of evidence that something was worth the investment. But Tuesday of the 5th week was when Aria noticed the change in her sister's face when Adrian walked into a room, and the specific quality of Adrian's attention when Mira was talking. The way it didn't wander, which was notable for a man whose attention was constitutionally inclined to wander, the way a river is inclined toward low ground. She said nothing about it to either of them. It was not her territory. But she noticed it the way you notice something that makes you exhale, quietly and completely, and with a warmth that had nothing performative in it. Mira came to her room on a Wednesday evening and said, "I'm not going home." Aria looked up from the text she was reading. "I know," she said. Mira looked at her for a moment. "You knew." "I noticed," Aria said. "There's a difference." Mira sat down. She looked at her hands for a moment and then looked at her sister, and what was on her face was the complicated mixture of vulnerability and certainty that characterized Mira whenever she was in the process of accepting something she wanted very much. "He's a lot," Mira said. "He is," Aria agreed. "He talks constantly." "You like it?" Mira made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "I like it," she admitted. He says what he means. He doesn't manage what he gives you." She paused. "I've never had that. From a man?" "Neither had I," Aria said. "Until now." They sat together in the warm room with the fire and the window overlooking the courtyard. And the conversation that followed was not about love or risk or the future or any of the large topics those things implied, but about small ones. About the drainage proposal Aria had suggested to Sarah, about Mira's interest in the Citadel's textile stores, about the particular quality of the Southern Highland winter compared to Ashvin's. They talked the way sisters talk when they have survived something difficult together and are on the other side of it, and don't need to name that explicitly because the other person already knows. At some point, Mira said, "Do you miss Ashvin?" Aria thought about it honestly. "Yes," she said. "I miss the particular smell of it in early spring, and Petra Voss sometimes, and the way the pine trees at the east edge of the village look at sunset in autumn." She paused. "I don't miss the rest of it, the smallness of it, the way it made it easy to stay smaller than I needed to be." "It kept you safe," Mira said. "It kept me managed," Aria said. "Safe and managed are not the same thing. I know that better now." Mira was quiet for a moment. "She'd be proud of you," she said. "Mother." The fire crackled. Outside, the Highland wind moved against the Citadel's stone walls with the low, continuous sound it had made for 4 generations of thorns, and would make for 4 more. "I think she'd be proud of both of us," Aria said. Winter turned. The Highlands thawed in increments, the process slow and grudging the way northern seasons always were. Mud and frost alternating for weeks before the genuine warmth arrived. The outer settlement sent riders as the roads improved, the flow of people and information through the Citadel picking up with the season. She was present for all of it. She was learning the shape of the territory, not as an observer, but as a participant, attending the trade meetings, sitting in on the settlement disputes that came to the Citadel for resolution, gradually developing the kind of knowledge that could only come from paying attention to the same system for long enough to understand how its pieces related to each other. Ryland never positioned her as ceremonial. He never managed what she was allowed to see or know or say. What he did, consistently and without drama, was treat her presence as a given, in meetings, in decisions, in the daily functioning of a territory that was now, under pack law, and by his explicit statement, and increasingly in the practical reality of how things actually worked, hers as much as his. The household had made its adjustment. The outer settlement leaders were making theirs, which was slower and more variable and required more patience, but was happening. Councilwoman Dara Greymount had sent a formal message of recognition, terse, Aldrich adjacent in its economy, that Aria had read 3 times and kept. Lucas Crane, she heard through Ryland's intelligence network, had completed his claiming of Celestine Ashworth without incident. The Ashworth Alliance had been formally incorporated into the Crane Pack structure. Lucas had what he'd calculated for. Whether he had what he'd wanted was a different question, and not one she had the interest or the information to answer. She let him go. Completely. This time, with the specific finality of something properly set down rather than dropped. She had given him honesty in the courtyard at Cravenhold, and she had meant it, and the meaning of it had continued to be true in the weeks since, and eventually she stopped noticing its absence in her daily accounting of things. That, she would think later, was the truest measure of having moved past something, not the dramatic moment of release, but the ordinary morning when you realize you haven't thought about it in several days and feel nothing particular about that fact. Spring had been in the Highlands for 3 weeks when she understood she was pregnant. She understood it the way women understand such things. Gradually, and then with certainty, the body's signals accumulating into a pattern that couldn't be interpreted any other way. She sat with it alone for 2 days, not from reluctance, but from the private habit of needing to fully understand something herself before she gave it to anyone else. On the evening of the second day, she found Rylan in the map room, where he often was in the evenings, working the intersection of territory and logistics that was the endless operational reality of governing a large pack. And she stood in the doorway and looked at him. He looked up. She watched his face read hers, the specific attention of a man who had spent months learning to see her accurately. And she watched the reading arrive at its conclusion. He was very still for a moment. Then he set down his pen. "Come here," he said. She crossed the room and sat beside him at the map table, and he took her hand in both of his with the careful steadiness of someone handling something they understood the full weight of, and they were quiet together for a moment in the way that the most significant things often begin, not with words, because words come second to the thing itself, always. How do you feel?" he asked. "I feel like I need to eat something," she said, immediately and constantly. He laughed, a real one, full and unguarded, the kind she'd been learning to produce in him with a consistency that still surprised her sometimes. He got up and went to the side table where the evening provisions were kept and came back with bread and dried fruit and cold meat and set it all in front of her with the practical, unsentimental efficiency of a man solving a problem he'd identified. She ate. He watched her with the particular quality of attention that was different now. Fuller, if that was possible, containing something new in it that she was going to need time to name properly. "A year ago," she said between bites, "I was in Ashfin. I was counting down to the moonball. I was holding a promise I was already starting not to believe in." She looked at the food, then at him. "I thought the best possible outcome of that night was being claimed in front of a room of people who'd overlooked me my whole life. And instead," he said, she said, "I got argued with by a council elder, fought over by 3 brothers, challenged under ancient pack law, and wound up in the Southern Highlands reading 40-year-old border concession records by lamplight." She paused. "It was better. Better than being publicly claimed by Lucas Crane," he said. "Infinitely," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You know that I—" He stopped. He was not by nature a man who spoke about internal states easily. She had learned this about him the way you learn the landscape of a place you're living in, gradually, through repeated contact. He tried again. "I have admired you for 2 years, from a distance that I maintained because I had to, not because I wanted to. And I have been learning you more closely for 5 months. And what I know now is that whatever I understood about you at the Harvest Crossing, whatever it was that made me stay in that territory for a week longer than I'd planned and watch a woman challenge a crossing warden with chalk figures on a flour sack, it was accurate, but it was also approximately 1/10 of the actual thing." She looked at him. "You're more than I understood," he said simply. "I wanted you to know that." The fire in the map room burned. The Highland wind moved outside. The territory stretched in every direction around the citadel's stone walls, 14 settlements and 2 citadels, and an outer range, and the long roads between them all. And somewhere in the east wing, Mira was probably talking to Adrian with the focused intensity she brought to everything she decided was worth her time. "Rylan," she said. "Yes." "I'm going to need a larger role in the Eastern settlement allocation process," she said. "The current structure has an inefficiency in the 4th quarter provisioning cycle that's going to create a shortage in the 2nd winter month if no one addresses it before autumn." He stared at her. She ate a piece of bread. "You're telling me about Eastern settlement allocation," he said. "I noticed it last week and I've been thinking about how to raise it," she said. This seemed like a reasonable moment. He looked at her for a long, long moment, and then the quiet smile arrived. The real one, the one that had nothing performed in it, the one she had first seen in a ballroom 4 months ago and had been the truest consistent thing about him across everything that had happened since. "I'll schedule a meeting," he said. "Good," she said. Outside, the Highland evening settled into dark. the stars coming up hard and clear over the southern ridge the way they always did when the air was this cold and this clean. And inside the map room of the Thorn Citadel, a woman who had walked into a ballroom with nothing but her sister's handmade dress, and the stubborn dignity of someone who has never had the luxury of giving up, sat beside the man who had crossed a crowded room to tell her not to leave, and ate bread, and made plans. Not because the story had arrived at its end, but because she had arrived at its beginning. She had stood in a room full of people who had decided what she was worth and refused to be reduced to their accounting. She had held an argument with ancient documents and chalk figure stubbornness, and the kind of intelligence that doesn't require a pack name or a title to be real. She had walked through every room that wasn't built for her and left it changed slightly by the fact of her having been there. The man who had rejected her had lost the story he thought he was telling. The woman in the blue silk had formed her opinions and been wrong. The council had ruled and the precedent would stand, and somewhere in the Citadel's record rooms the documentation of Aria Vale's standing would sit in its file for the next 4 generations, available to anyone who needed it. And in Ashfin, the cottage stood with its cracked window glass and its smoking chimney and its memories of 2 sisters by lamplight. And in spring, the pine trees at the east edge of the village would look the way they always looked at sunset in autumn, which Aria would not be there to see, and would carry with her anyway, the way you carry the places that formed you. Not as weight, as foundation. She finished the bread. She looked at her husband, that word, still new enough that it arrived with a slight adjustment, the way correct things feel when you're still growing into them. And she thought about the year ahead, and the one after that, and the child who was going to be born into a territory, and a name, and a mother who had learned, through the particular curriculum of a very hard night and everything it had set in motion, that standing was not something given to you. It was something you proved. She had proved it, not once, in a single dramatic moment, but in every room and every road and every conversation and every document read by lamplight, and in the specific, ongoing daily choice to remain exactly herself regardless of who expected her to be smaller. That was hers. It had always been hers. Now everything else was too.